Good evening, everybody. It's your favorite aspiring revolutionary here, a wandering author, reminding you that we're all the authors of our own lives. As always, I'm hanging out with my trusty sidekick, Madeline. My message remains the same: spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. Wearing a new hat today. This big head only really fits into beanies. Fortunately, the trade-off is unparalleled intelligence. No, I'm just joking. Anyways, no, I've been looking at houses lately. I think I'm probably about to buy a house somewhere in Huntsville next month. Like within 30 days, maybe 60 days at the longest. By the way, today's topic will be Periclean Athens, which is Athens under the rule of Pericles. But as far as the houses go, I think what I want to do, even though interest rates are at like 8% right now, I've seen quite a few homes that are like under $150,000, meaning like the monthly payment would be like $700. But there's houses with these 2-car garages that would be absolutely a cakewalk to transform them into basically an at-home skate park. So then before and after work every day, I can start the day by activating my vestibular system, improving my ability to learn and retain information. Also, I'll get much better at skateboarding. I almost landed a kickflip for the first time ever today, which is very impressive because for the past 10 years I've only been able to do an ollie, and then since I finished my summer travels I've just gotten way better. But anyways, the last time we spoke about Athens, they were repelling the Persians, and following the Persian Wars, Athenian prosperity reached lofty heights, celebrated by the Boeotian poet Pindar as, quote, radiant, violent crowd famed in song, the bulwark of Greece. Growing business and employment opportunities drew droves of metics, and metics are like free people. They're not slaves, but they're not Athenian citizens. Actual citizens and slaves to the port city of Piraeus, transforming it from a small village into an actual planned city. Remember, Piraeus was the port that the Athenians built in order to kind of, oh man, look at these horses. They're kind of bowing up on my dog. She's very skittish though, so she's not going to do nothing. Anyways, 50 years elapsed between the Persian Wars and the Second Peloponnesian War. And by the end of that time, Athens will have grown to be Greece's most populous city, perhaps reaching as many as 340,000 people. Now, that figure is kind of weird. 340K is a pretty large town. I grew up in a town called Fort Walton Beach in Florida that was moderate sized with about 40,000 people, so about 6 times that size. But of those 340,000 people, only 50,000 of them were actual adult males, meaning real citizens. The 175,000 of them, so the majority were wives and children. 90,000, so double the number of free adult males, were slaves, and then 25,000 of them were metics. Of that 50,000 adult male population, like the actual citizens, about half of those, about 25,000, were wealthy enough to serve as hoplites. So if you know anything about ancient Greece, hoplites, they're like the guys that fight with the shields and the spears and the closely tight-packed phalanxes. You're probably familiar with them from the great movie 300. And the thing is to be a part of those, you had to buy your own weapons and shields, which were expensive. So you couldn't do it unless you were basically a part of the middle class or wealthy. The exploding population had profound consequences on Athenian foreign policy, though, because they were no longer able to support everybody on what they could produce at home alone. Like, they could not grow enough food in the house or on their own soil to support everybody anymore. Which means they have to start being really friendly to people that they may not have otherwise been friendly with. Throughout the classical age, Athens will have to import wheat to supplement its domestic barley production. We know that from archaeological records, and they were pretty notorious for keeping detailed shipping logs. The grain situation was so crucial that a grain report, quote unquote, preceded every meeting of the assembly. So it'd be like if our Congress, before Congress met, every time they started talking about our corn situation or something, because we were so dependent on corn. I mean, it makes sense if you're people are going to starve without it, then you better keep an eye on it, right? In the 3rd century, an annually elected board of, quote, buyers of grain was developed to ensure regular and adequate supplies from abroad and their equitable distribution at home. So grain was hashtag big business back then. Funnily enough, Ukraine was always Athens' principal breadbasket. I mean, it wasn't called Ukraine back then, but the modern nation state didn't exist yet, but the Athenians did import most of their grain from the northern coast of the Black Sea. Hashtag things never change. Before the war, at least, Ukraine was still one of Europe's biggest producers and exporters of grain. Why does that matter, though? Well, for the Athenians to stay fed, ships had to pass through the Narrows. So where Ukraine is in the Black Sea, to get down to Greece, where Turkey meets Greece, there's the Bosporus, the Propontis, and the Hellespont, these straits that were very difficult. Oh, wow, I don't know if you can see them, but there's deer over there. I can't believe it. Well, actually, I can believe it. There's lots of deer out here. And because all grain had to pass through these straits, if an enemy power gained control of them, anybody who could gain control of the Narrows could bring Athens to her knees in an instant. And that doesn't change at all throughout this period. Consequently, Athens plays very nicely with the people who live near these straits. Another huge thing that happens as we enter the age of Pericles is democracy is radicalized. If you remember from our earlier videos on the Archaic Age in Athens, there has always been an ebb and flow of power between oligarchs and democrats. In the 470s and 460s, but this erupted into open hostilities in 462 when a man named Ephialtes led democratic forces to overturn the last bit of power held by the oligarchic Areopagus Council. This was a group of oligarchs that had basically controlled the political power of Athens previously. They assessed the conduct of office holders, but then Ephialtes, who we don't know much about, unfortunately, other than the fact that he gave the power to the people. Now, state representatives would be evaluated by the people instead of other members of the elite or the oligarchy. Simultaneously, popular courts were elevated to courts of first instance rather than just appeal courts. So this guy, Ephialtes, refashioned the Helia, which was like the people's court, as the Diacasteria, the people's court. And now the people were the juries and the assembly. So again, before this time, tyrants were ruling Athens, and if it weren't tyrants, then it was small groups of oligarchs. This guy Ephialtes, supposedly, this is the predecessor to Pericles. He all of a sudden puts judicial and political power in the hands of the Athenian people. The people's courts even had the power to annul legislation. The Athenian people now had effective control of all important political and judicial matters, and the reason why this is important is it's a first in history, at least in Western history. 2 disgruntled oligarchs had Ephialtes murdered, and Pericles, son of Xanthippus, took over Ephialtes' role as the champion of the people. So Pericles then goes even further and champions the people's causes, introduces pay for juries, removing the obstacle to poor people from serving, and thus lessening the poor's dependency on the patronage of the wealthy even further. And because of this, the poor people end up dominating the courts. Speakers learned, and even like we can see from the records that like the way that people spoke in court changes because of this in this era. They're no longer speaking only to upper class, well-to-do folks, they're speaking to common people. Pay would also be introduced for military service and counselors shortly after. And at this point, Athens has literally one of the most radical democracies the world has ever seen. In theory, each citizen had the ability to directly participate in the affairs of state, which is something that we don't even have today. Hashtag revolutionary. Modern nation states, like what we live in, use representational systems. In other words, we elect our representatives to represent us. And the closest that we can even get to direct democracy in the United States today is with referendums. And the rules of those vary by state, and many governors can overturn them even if we do pass them. So, in other words, in Athens, quote unquote, we the people, they were the government, which is something that we don't have today. And there's arguments for and against it, but That's why this period, Periclean Athens, is such an interesting time period. Now, at the same time, we do need to be honest and say people like women in Athens couldn't vote. And again, the actual male population that were real citizens could almost be considered an oligarchy of sorts, because they were only 50,000 out of a population of 340,000. So, since so many lower class men were needed to defend Athens and man her warships, the impetus for democratic radicalization likely originated from below. # solidarity. To maintain their democracy, Athenian citizens participated in government frequently, and each year 6,000 men over the age of 30 were enrolled as jurors and distributed amongst the courts, meeting up to 15 times each month. It's a lot of civic participation. I couldn't imagine serving on jury 15 times a month. Thousands of adults attended daily the daily assembly meetings in the morning, and a commitment to democracy was expressed by systematically denying most political officers from cultivating personal power bases. In fact, most of their political offices were subject to annual elections, and they had term limits of only 1 year, and not only that, you could not get reelected. So, and then even if you did start to get around those rules, the people had the ability to quote-unquote ostracize you, which is they would vote to expel you from the city. Now, that's enough about Periclean Athens for today. We'll go more into it and talk about their public finance and some of the laws and taxes, citizenship, and how the actual mechanics of this place worked. Today, we're just setting up an era of real democracy, one of the first eras of real democracy in all of human history, when Ephialtes and Pericles really reject the oligarchic and tyrant forces that had been controlling Athens throughout the Archaic Age, and puts power firmly in the hands of the Athenian people. This also sets in motion events that eventually lead to our democracy here in the United States today. So it's an interesting time period, and without these men's deeds, the world would be much different, even 2,000 years later. So, as always, my message remains the same. This is a wandering author here to remind you that we are all the authors of our own lives. Spend less, live more, earn your freedom with frugality. What are you guys doing in order to inspire, uplift, and empower your local community today? Because this world isn't changing unless we all do our part. You can count on me to do mine daily. Till next time, I love y'all.